to order. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Hubley, a senator from Prince Edward Island, and I am pleased to chair this morning's meeting. The committee is continuing its examination of Bill S-203, an act to amend the Criminal Code and other acts, ending the captivity of whales and dolphins. We are pleased to welcome Ms. Marino, President, the Whale Sanctuary Project, and Mr. Hal Whitehead, Professor, Department of Biology, Dalhousie University. On behalf of the members of the committee, I thank you for being here today. I understand you have opening remarks, following which the members of the committee will have questions for you. You may proceed.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's an honor. I've been a marine mammal researcher and an educator for over 25 years. And I've studied the educational impact of zoos and aquariums on conservation. I've been asked to talk to you today about research conducted in facilities in Canada holding captive dolphins and whales. And if you indulge me, I would also like to very briefly discuss the educational claims made by these facilities, as both of those are tied in together. First, for the research. I've conducted an extensive analysis of original peer-reviewed research with captive dolphins and whales at both the Vancouver Aquarium and Marineland. I found that there are only about 5 studies done at the Vancouver Aquarium using captive cetaceans that have even a potentially minimal impact on conservation for wild dolphins and whales. My analysis was conducted using standard search engines and methods used in the scientific community. I also conducted a citation analysis of each paper. A citation analysis is a standard way to measure the impact of a scientific paper. It counts how many other authors, independent authors, cite that paper, and whether the paper is important to the scientific community. Here are my results. The number of in-house studies of captive dolphins and whales conducted by the Vancouver Aquarium over a 30-year history is 13. That means that they've published, on average, 1 paper every 2.3 years. As for the impact of those papers that were published, only 5 of the 13 were cited more than 4 times by independent authors, and of those 5, the most times any given paper was cited was 4. In other words, over 30 years, the Vancouver Aquarium has conducted only 13 published studies using captive dolphins and whales. Only 5 of those have been cited more than a few times by the rest of the scientific community, and of those, the citation rate is low. As for Marineland, which, to be fair, doesn't tout itself as a research facility, only 6 research papers were conducted using their captive dolphins and whales over 10 years. Only 3 have been cited by independent authors, and of those, only 1 had any relevance to wild cetaceans. In summary, there is little to no evidence for the claim that either the Vancouver Aquarium or Marineland are conducting research with captive dolphins and whales that has any relevance to conservation of wild cetaceans. Therefore, if captive cetacean research was terminated in Canada tomorrow, the impact on conservation would be negligible at best. As for education, I have researched and published peer-reviewed papers on the issue of whether or not seeing these animals in concrete tanks has any educational value. I even provided oral and written testimony on the issue to the U.S. Congress in 2010. I conducted several published surveys conducted by of professional organization surveys where the AZA and the Alliance of Marine Mammal Parks and Aquariums, the United States version of CASA, if you will, were claiming evidence for learning and attitude change after visits to marine parks. I found that these studies were flawed in methodology, and to date, there is no compelling evidence to support the educational value of marine mammal displays claimed by aquariums and marine parks. Moreover, there is published peer-reviewed research evidence demonstrating that seeing animals on display along with humans actually decreases conservation concerns. So in summary, a review of the research output of the Vancouver Aquarium and Marineland does not support the claim that keeping dolphins and whales in captivity is necessary for research and conservation. The Vancouver Aquarium has had 30 years to demonstrate the utility of captive research with these animals and has failed to do that. Moreover, they offer much more potentially substantive experiences through their outreach activities, such as the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup, than they ever can do through keeping dolphins and whales in concrete tanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Whitehead, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. In addition to being a professor at Dalhousie University, I am co-chair for marine mammals of COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. I've been studying whales and dolphins in the wild since 1974, with a particular focus on their social structure, culture, populations, and conservation. Fundamentally, we scientists study whales and dolphins to understand their biology as well as to promote conservation. Much of this research is done at sea, often with technologies such as hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, tags, and drones. Usually, this research is observational. There is also research on whales and dolphins in captivity. Much more of the captive research uses manipulative experiments. Experimental studies tend to be more definitive than observations, but set against this is the unnatural setting of captivity that often makes interpretation of results problematic. This is particularly the case for whales and dolphins, as the captive environment is especially unnatural. As a few examples, captive whales and dolphins live in a space that is less than a millionth, and in the case of killer whales, less than a billionth of the area of their natural home ranges. Rather than facing a wide range of living prey, they are typically fed dead fish. These are extremely acoustic animals. That is how they sense their world and communicate. Concrete tanks are debilitating echo chambers. Whales and dolphins are also extremely social, by some measures more social than we are. And the captive social environment is utterly different from their social life in the wild. These and other factors make much of the research on captive whales and dolphins problematic and have led most scientists not connected to the captivity industry, some philosophers, and much of the Canadian public to consider the captivity industry unethical. Now, research in captivity has given us lots of interesting insights into the nature of the animals, perhaps especially their physiologies and their cognition, although there is continuing uncertainty about how these results refer to animals in the wild. Most important captive results come from dedicated research facilities, especially those of the US Navy and the University of Hawaii, not from display facilities. Ethical standards for scientific research are tightening, and research that was standard is now no longer considered ethical. From the perspective of conservation, studies of animals in captivity tend to ask the wrong questions about the wrong species. I looked at reports on the status of 3 emblematic Canadian whale species, members of 2 of which are held in captivity. In the 2015 Kasiwik Status Report on the endangered St. Lawrence beluga, about 1.4% of the main text of the report refers to captive animals. In the 2011 Kasiwik Status Report on the endangered Scotian Shelf bottlenose whale, there is no mention at all of animals in captivity. In the 2008 Kasiwik Status Report on the killer whale, including the endangered southern resident population, about 2% of the main text refers to captive animals. None of these small parts of the reports referring to captivity are vital or even, in my opinion, important when assessing the conservation of these species. Thus, while studies of whales in captivity have given interesting and sometimes academically useful information, their contribution to the conservation of Canadian species has been virtually zero. Past research on captive animals is being replaced by new techniques in the wild, including experiments. For instance, controlled exposure experiments on wild animals have given major advances in how we understand the effects of underwater noise on whales. If this bill passes, some animals will still be in captivity for rehabilitation, and there may be rescued animals in semi-captive sanctuaries, both opportunities for gaining knowledge. In addition, computer modeling is replacing some captive animal studies. So in summary, if captive displays of whales and dolphins end, our ability to conserve the animals in the wild will be virtually ineffective. And although studies of captive whales and dolphins have informed us about aspects of their biology, much of this information stream can be replaced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to questions, and our first question is from Senator McGuinness.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for coming. Mr. Whitehead, how would the computer modeling, which is replacing some of the studies and so on, how would this work? How does it work?
It works by taking information that we do know and using that to make inferences about the things that we don't know. And because many of biological systems are typically complex and non-linear, this it usually cannot be done without a fairly complex model. Computer modeling also can give us an idea of how robust those results are. So modern computer modeling allows us to take, say, information we have about physiology, about feeding, and give us inferences about the energetics of the animals, which may be important, for instance, in trying to assess the effects of disturbance on them.
I want to go to in your remarks, you stated that whales and dolphins are also extremely social by some measures, more social than us. And the captive social environment is utterly different from their social life in the wild. These and other factors make much of the research on captive whales and dolphins problematic and have led most scientists not connected to the captivity industry, some philosophers, and much of the Canadian public to consider the captivity industry unethical. And further, you said ethical standards for scientific research are tightening, and research was standard is now no longer considered ethical. So those are pretty strong statements.
Mm-hmm.
How do you how do you feel about mammals that are injured in captivity? I mean, is that unethical?
Sorry, animals that are injured in captivity? Bringing animals that have been injured in the wild into captivity and trying to rehabilitate them, I don't think is unethical, and I think most of the sources that you quoted from me wouldn't think that is unethical, and I would support the continuation of organizations such as the Vancouver Aquarium to help animals that have been injured in the wild.
So who sets the standard as to whether it's ethical or not?
The Canadian Association of
Zoos and aquariums.
well, there's two. No, for research, the standards done at universities as set by, I'm afraid I can't remember the name or the acronym, but there is a national body which sets standards for scientific research, and so they would govern any research done through a Canadian university, and I think those standards are also generally applied to non-university environments. As far as non-research standards, then I think Laurie can answer that more directly.
Well, I think CASA should, if they don't, have some say in what is done in captivity. But it really does depend upon whether or not that research is initiated at a university with a principal investigator who is a faculty member at a university, or someone who is employed by an aquarium or marine park to do the research.
Okay. I don't want to prolong it. I'll come back in a second. I was just going to say, Ms. Marino, that you didn't talk about the whale sanctuary project, which I'm interested in. I'll come around in a second.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering if it was the Canadian Council on Animal Care that you were thinking of.
Yes. Senator Hubley, that's what I was thinking of. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move now to Senator Plett.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I have a number of questions, so you'll cut me off at the appropriate time, and then I'll go to the next round. And the majority of my questions are for Ms. Marino. I guess, first of all, you said you were an educator. So my first questions are along the line of what qualifications do you have? Do you have a veterinarian in medicine education?
I have a PhD in neuroscience and animal behavior, and I've taught at a major research university, Emory University in Atlanta, for 20 years.
So you have not passed any necessary qualifying exams to practice veterinary medicine or marine mammal medicine, are not a member of any recognized marine mammal medical organization, have never medically treated a marine mammal?
I'm not making a claim that I'm medically treating. I'm making a claim as an educator, and I've been a professional educator for over 25 years.
Okay. I have an article here in front of me, Ms. Marino, from 2016, which shows the results of an investigation that an LA-based organization called Last Chance for Animals, where they made a series of false allegations against Marineland based on, and this is according to their organization, your expert testimony, as well as a video that many people believe has been manipulated. The OSPCA, of course, investigated, and they found that these allegations were unfounded. After a thorough investigation, the video depicted an emaciated baby beluga calf named Gia, separated from her mother and left alone in an isolation pool. And of course, people were horrified, and I've seen the video. When the OSPCA followed up on this, they of course found that Gia was a very healthy young whale swimming around in the pool in Marineland. And I visited Marineland and I saw it. So my first question, Ms. Marino, is as you are listed as the expert opinion for LCA, are you qualified to treat or diagnose marine animals or mammals?
I'm qualified to not diagnose and treat as a veterinarian, but I certainly am qualified enough to know that an animal is emaciated. I am qualified to understand when an animal is exhibiting behaviors that are indicative of chronic stress and abnormality, as those beluga whales were exhibiting at Marineland. And studying these animals for 25 years, I am qualified to understand and note what behavior is healthy and what behavior is not healthy. And the animals in Marineland that I saw in person and in those videotapes were exhibiting unhealthy behavior.
So you have visited Marineland?
Yes, I have.
Mr. Whitehead stated whales are very social. You go beyond that and have stated that, in fact, there is abundant, unquestionable evidence for personhood for animals. You have also stated that human is the biological term that describes us as species. Person, though, is about the kind of beings we are, sentient and conscious. That applies to most animals too. They are persons, or should be legally. Is it your belief that most animals should be afforded rights as persons under the Canadian law?
I'm not here to discuss whether or not any particular species is to be considered a person under Canadian law. However, to answer your question, personhood is not a biological term. It's a term that refers to any organism that has autonomy, self-awareness, emotions, and a life to lead. And that certainly describes cetaceans, dolphins and whales. So yes, I do believe that dolphins and whales are persons under that definition.
Well, first of all, Ms. Marino, and I don't want to get into a battle here with you, but you are here to discuss the questions that we ask.
Yes.
And so when you say you're not here to discuss something, that isn't correct. If you ask the question,
okay, I'm sorry, I just answered you.
Fair enough. Presently, animals are considered property under the Canadian laws, and their maintenance and care is the responsibility of their owner. Persons who, and I quote, cannot understand relevant information or cannot appreciate what may happen as a result of decisions they make or do not make about their finances, health, or personal care are considered mentally incapacitated by the province of Ontario. People considered mentally incapacitated have public guardians appointed for them if they have not previously signed a power of attorney. Ontario is the home to more than 50 whales that you consider to be persons. Would you consider whales to be able to make the decisions about their finances, their health, and their personal care? And if not, would the costs of providing such care fall on the province of Ontario if personhood was granted to the whales in the province, like you are suggesting?
Thank you for your question. Obviously, the idea of finances and matters of that nature aren't relevant to a non-human species. However, if all of the captive cetaceans in Canada were considered persons and they were represented legally by guardians, then I think that those guardians would have the best interest of the animals at heart. The idea that a beluga whale cannot understand his or her situation, I think is an extreme statement, because the fact is that we have a lot of scientific evidence to tell us that these animals don't thrive in concrete tanks. So they may not be able to tell us in words that they are not doing well or that they are unhealthy, but they do it with the scientific evidence for their abnormal behavior, their levels of chronic stress, their unhealthy dispositions, and their short lives.
I will ask one more question, Senator Hubley, and then I'll go in the next round, please, if the clerk will put me down for I find another issue that I read about a little disturbing, and that is that the Last Chance for Animals group stated that they had an undercover investigator monitoring the alleged abuse at Marineland in 2015. So they were monitoring this in 2015, and they have found, according to them, abuses. The park closed in September of 2015, and nothing was done. They only opened up in the following spring. Nothing was done about this alleged abuse until January 2016, ironically, precisely with the timing of the second reading for this bill in the Senate. So the timeline shows that it would have been a minimum of 4 to 5 months after the fact, after they found horrible abuses at Marineland. Do you know why LCA would have chosen not to act immediately if they were concerned about the abuse depicted in the questionable video?
Senator Platt, I don't know, and I'm not responsible for LCA. Let me just briefly explain what happened. LCA asked me to review some videotapes of the beluga whales at Marineland. They sent me a bunch of videotapes that went from one date to the next, and they said, just tell us what you see in this videotape. I was not privy to any of the decisions that they made as an organization or exactly what was going on in-house in their organization. I was just brought in as an independent observer to tell them what I saw on those videotapes. What I saw on those videotapes were beluga whales who were crammed together in tanks much too small for them. I saw beluga whales who were exhibiting abnormal behaviors, stereotypies, and I observed female beluga whales with blood coming out of their breasts, which is a sign of infection. And this is what I told LCA. And that was the extent of my involvement in what they did with that information. So I'm not privy to that information. I don't know the answer. You should ask them.
Well, if they attend, I most certainly will. Thank you, Chair, and if you could put me down for a second round, please.
Thank you, Senator Platt. Senator Enverga, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I was actually I got a question for both of you, and it's more like on your assertion that there is no compelling evidence to support educational value of marine mammal displays, right? You mentioned that, and I'm wondering what you're going to be telling all those kids, all those people who watch them, what's the magnificence and the beauty of these animals. I mean, what are you going to tell them? I mean, don't you think that when they watch them visually, people are sometimes educated visually, you know? And that's how they see these animals as so great and such smart animals. However, I mean, don't you think it helps them at least to appreciate our natural, our nature more deeply when they see these animals by person?
I wish that were true. I really do. But in fact, as an educator, I have to, if I have a class of students and I teach them for a whole semester, and then I ask them, did you have a good time? Or did you learn anything? And they all raise their hand, and I give them all A's, and they go away. I probably would be fired. And that's exactly what these captive facilities are doing. They're claiming education without any actual substantive evidence. Sure, people have a good time seeing lots of interesting things and doing novel things. That doesn't make it education. When you actually look at the data or the lack of data for this claim that's continually being made, it just isn't there.
But don't you think you will be asking the wrong question there? Have you had a good time? I mean, what if we ask them, what do you think of these animals? Are they happy, or are they in good condition? Do they look good? Do you think we should protect them in the wild? I mean, are those things? Those are the questions that What if you ask
Yeah.
them? What will happen to?
Those surveys have been done mainly by people in the captivity industry. And what they generally do is they take an entrance poll and then an exit poll. So they ask people right after they've seen a show or a display, and they say, do you think that, it's important to conserve dolphins and whales? Or do you think these animals are happy? And they've just been to a show where they've been told this is important for conservation and these animals are happy. So they parrot that back. But there's absolutely no evidence that that's long-term learning, that that's real attitude change, and that it translates into anything that resembles conservation behavior. So these types of exit polls are out there, but they have methodological flaws that make them very dubious in terms of as a basis for the educational value claim for these animals. I wish you were right. I really do. The evidence is just not there.
Yeah, but there's really no evidence no concrete evidence that's saying these people feels bad about this. I mean, this students doesn't appreciate what's being done. I mean, there's no.
Yeah.
Are there any concrete evidence? I mean, other than a small portion of maybe a small population?
Well, the question of whether you mean people feeling bad about seeing the animals in a concrete
people
tank?
thinking that it's not a good thing for the animals, that they don't have any educational value. I mean, is
Well,
there any concrete evidence there?
again, the claim is being made by the captivity industry, not the scientists like myself who are evaluating that claim. They're making the claim that there's educational value to seeing a dolphin or a whale in a concrete tank or in a show. And I'm simply saying, show me the data. Show me the evidence and I'll go away. But the evidence isn't there.
Well, I have personal evidence actually with my kid who's watching the show.
Yeah.
That's a personal evidence. It's a concrete evidence. And you know what? They really liked it, and they even are now curious on how they live in the wild. I mean, don't you think? By the way, my kid is, developmentally delayed. But the thing is, these kids love the animals there, and I don't think they would even have a chance to see them in the wild, if not for this.
The question is whether or not that's education or just having a good time. And we know, and I'm glad that your kids have a good time. I really am. And I hope that they learn something. But singular examples like this don't make evidence. And the fact of the matter is this, is that if you were to take your child to a school and the idea was for your child to learn, and that school didn't have any way of evaluating whether or not your child actually learned, you would pull that child out of school immediately, and rightfully so. So I'm saying if you want to make a claim that people have a good time and are excited about seeing the animals, that's one thing. If you want to make a claim that you are actually educating people and that education is important for the conservation of wild animals, you're making a claim that's in search of evidence.
Yeah, but okay, anyway, but this just the point that I'm pretty sure my daughters really enjoyed it and they learned a lot.
Sure.
I mean, that's good. And I can see all the kids too. I mean, that's evidence.
Sure,
But anyway, I will not
enjoyed it.
argue with that too much, except that I think it's flawed in some ways. But I got a question for Mr. Whitehead. We're talking. You told me that you told us the concrete tanks are debilitating echo chambers. Is that one of the major reasons why you don't think whales should be in captivity? Is that what you're preparing to have?
The captive environment is completely different to the environment in which I study them at sea, and they live their lives at sea. And that is one respect, yes. So these animals, the three species I mentioned, the killer whale, the beluga whale, the bottlenose whale, are extremely vocal animals. In the wild, they're making sounds a large part of the time. And that is their primary sense. That is how they see their world. it isn't a perfect analogy, but for me, it would be if I had to live in about a half of this room and all the walls were covered with mirrors, that would have, it's something of an analogy for what it's like for an acoustic animal to be in a concrete tank where every sound it makes or anything else makes is echoes all around.
So would you say that if they put some somewhere like sound, against echo-proof walls, I would say, would that make it better?
It probably would, yes.
And it will help you. It
Well,
will
it would
help you believe that it's the right way to do it, right?
Well, that is one of the other factors are just the size of the tank. That is not going to be changed. You can double its size, but it's still a millionth of what they would normally live. The social life isn't changed. The social environment they're in that tank is completely different to their social life in the wild, and that social life is vital for those animals. There are other elements. The feeding too is totally different.
Well, but the oceans are changing, right? So it could change any time. I mean, I think that. Well, anyway, it's not. So, do you think the changes will help them at least? I mean, there will always be changes in the ocean. I mean, pollution, all kinds of commercial activities in the ocean. I mean, don't you think it really makes the ecology of the whole place of where the whales live? Do they change? What do you think about that?
Certainly, the ecology of the ocean changes. It changes naturally in very dramatic ways, especially over large timescales. So, in both the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, there have been regime shifts where the whole ocean has switched, and the distribution of species has switched, and the animals out there, including and perhaps especially upper-level predators like the whales and dolphins, have, through evolutionary time, developed ways of dealing with this. And part of that is they have very diverse ways of making a living, which allow them to switch depending on what's going on. So this provides them a bit of resilience for the changes that we are making in the ocean. And so perhaps compared with some other parts of the natural world, they are a little bit more resilient. But the changes that we are now making to the ocean, especially in the medium term through climate change, in the shorter term through increasing levels of ocean noise, are very concerning to me, and I think to a lot of us who study the animals out there.
Okay, one last question, okay, please. Okay, I know that it's changing, right? But then and you see that there's some climate change, too much commercial activities around there. Don't you think when a kid look at this and say, look at the whales in the Marineland or something else? I mean, don't you think that they say these are the animals we want to protect, and we want to make sure that we protect our environment for this? I mean, don't you think it's one of the things that everybody will learn? I mean, say, I love this animal because I can see that they're fun, they're good, they're actually a great one. And how can I do? Well, what can I do to protect them in the wild? I mean, they look like they represent all the animals that's roaming in the wild. And don't you think it's something like that? I mean, there's some use to it.
I'm unlike Dr. Marino, I haven't, looked at the research on this. What I'd like to say is that two alternatives to that educational experience, which I do have familiarity with. One is the whale watching industry, and the other is wildlife films and TV and radio programs have enormous effects on people, and the experiences which these are giving people are improving all the time. And certainly a lot of my students taking classes in this because they were turned on. They went out on a boat, and you can go out on a boat to see whales in the majority of Canadian provinces, or they saw a CBC or BBC program that got them really interested in this.
Well, anyway, thank you. I don't want to take your time. I'll just go for the segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Enverga. Senator Christmas, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for your comments and your presentation. I'm very impressed with the research you've done on cetaceans. Dr. Marino, I noticed in your bio that after you did your 2001 study, you decided against undertaking any further research with captive animals. Can you share with us what caused you to make that decision and how your perspective on that applies to the study of this bill and its provisions?
Thank you. For quite a while, as a younger scientific professional, I did do work with dolphins and whales in captive facilities, that is, in concrete tanks. I studied things like their cognitive development, and I was most interested in self-awareness, which is the capacity to know that you exist, that you are you. And the paradigm I was using was the mirror self-recognition study, which has been used with great apes, elephants, and of course humans to probe whether someone recognizes themselves in a mirror. And if they do, that means that, oh, hey, that's me. I have a sense of me. There's a me there. That's a cognitive level of self-awareness you're bringing to that table, if you will. So I was working with Gordon Gallup, who is my PhD advisor at the time, who had done the seminal work on mirror self-recognition in primates and chimpanzees. It showed that they recognize themselves in mirrors. I was interested in seeing whether that could be replicated with bottlenose dolphins, who were also very intelligent, big-brained, and highly social, just like chimpanzees. So I conducted a number of studies with Dr. Diana Reese, and the study that we did at the New York Aquarium back in the very late 1990s was a study that took 2 years to do. And what we were able to do is replicate the paradigm that's used to probe whether an animal can recognize him or herself in the mirror. And we found definitive evidence that these animals were recognizing themselves in mirrors. And we would put spots on them, and they would look in the mirror and turn in one direction. I call it the zit response, because when you wake up in the morning and there's a big pimple on your head, you spend a lot of time in the mirror looking at it, touching it. So we replicated that response in a highly controlled way, obviously. And we found that these two bottlenose dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors. And at the time, I actually was bombarded with email from animal activists saying, well, now that you know this, what are you going to do about it, et cetera? And I didn't do anything for a while because I wanted to let the scientific evidence speak for itself. But a couple of years later, I started to really think about what life would be like in a small concrete tank going around and around and around if you were a self-aware being. And I didn't feel very good about what that felt like. But then what happened is those two young dolphins were transferred to another facility, and they died. They died at young ages. And that was just emblematic of what happens to dolphins and whales in captivity. They live short lives generally. So that hit me hard. And I really began to look into the captivity industry and what happens to dolphins and whales in these facilities. And it was not a pretty picture. And so that led me to make the decision professionally that I didn't want to promote or contribute to the keeping of these animals in these abusive situations by continuing to do research with them. And even though I had the ability to continue to do that work, I decided against it because I just didn't think it was ethical.
In your testimony, you mentioned, I guess, the lack of scientific value of doing research on captive cetaceans. I'm curious about in contrast to that, the value of scientific work on cetaceans in the wild. I haven't heard much of that work. And is there work going on in Canada, North America, about cetaceans in the wild?
Well, I will answer very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to somebody who's been doing that work. There's an abundance of work on wild dolphins and whales. In captivity, you can probe what animals can do under certain circumstances. When you do research with wild populations, you learn what they do. And that's very different, but I'll turn that over to Hal.
Okay, thank you. Yes, there's a considerable amount of research on cetaceans in the wild, around the world, and here in Canada. So some of it is looking at what we might call fairly basic things like numbers. So there are surveys done primarily by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, but also by other organizations to count whales and look at their distributions, and then to get an idea of whether they're increasing or decreasing and how they may interact with our activities in the ocean. There are also studies that work closely with Aboriginal and Inuit people, and especially with the Inuit, because they depend quite heavily on some whales and dolphins, and so in particular the Department of Fisheries and Oceans works with them to assess the populations that they are using, and a major part of their environment. And then there are studies which look, well, to put it in somewhat grand terms, to try and look at the nature of the whale. And of those studies, I would particularly like to emphasize the work done on the killer whales, or orcas, of British Columbia. The studies there are quite remarkable by the studies of any animals anywhere. Through the research of scientists at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, at the universities in BC and elsewhere, at the Vancouver Aquarium, and private small non-governmental research organizations. We have come to know those whales better than almost any other wild animals. And what we have learned is truly remarkable. These animals lead extraordinary lives. Just to give a couple of examples, this is one of the two or three examples of true menopause outside humans. And we're beginning to understand what's going on there, that the older females are, especially in times when resources are poor, taking an increased leadership role. They're really important to the lives of the other killer whales. They found that if an older female dies, then her son, in his prime breeding age, so take a 30-year-old son, who's about prime breeding age, has a roughly double rate of dying himself if his mother, who would be in her 50s or 60s, dies. So we've learned those kinds of things from research in the wild, from people who've spent an enormous amount of time watching the animals, listening to them, and getting to know them as individuals living in their natural habitats. Sorry, I went on long, but that's something I really feel pretty strongly about.
Thank you. I was curious about the nature of the research on wild animals. I also want to go back to Senator Envergas. I have a 6-year-old daughter as well who's extremely curious and loves animals. And what opportunities or what experiences can I offer my little 6-year-old to enjoy wild cetaceans?
Well, in Nova Scotia, we have 2 excellent whale watching opportunities. One is they're on opposite ends of the province. So on the southwest side of Briar Island, Long Island, the Digby Neck area, there's substantial whale watching opportunities with great opportunities to see quite a number of species in their natural environment with lots of other wonderful wildlife around. So I'd recommend that. The other is at the other end of Nova Scotia off the northern part of Cape Breton, where there's whale watching, mainly for pilot whales. And these are really fun whales to watch. I have students working with the whale watching industry there. And that's a really successful, small-scale industry, and it's provided, I think, some wonderful experiences for a lot of Nova Scotian youngsters, older people, and people from around the world.
And I'm familiar with those opportunities, and one of the wonderful things I see is that it not only provides a real life experience, but it also provides a source of income for individuals who are in rural areas who allow ecotourism opportunities to grow and flourish. So the economic benefits of ecotourism are huge in rural areas.
Yeah.
And to see the emphasis now on allowing visitors and people who are curious about these animals in the wild to go out and actually see them and experience them, it's incredible. So I wanted to get that on the record, that there's also a great opportunity to experience these animals in the wild, and ecotourism benefits enormously in rural areas. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Christmas. Senator Sinclair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I arrived a little late, so I didn't have a chance to introduce myself. I'm Senator Murray Sinclair from Manitoba. I want to thank you, Ms. Marino, for the research paper that you've done and the presentation you gave. All of us on this committee, I think, have been bombarded by emails organized by a campaign from the Vancouver Aquarium in which they allege they've been doing some very significant research, and now I have a response to all of those emails, and I thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, though, the paper that you presented and the presentation you gave us, talking about the impact of research conducted at Vancouver in the Marineland Aquarium, it was pretty focused on those two. But generally, I wonder if you could talk about captivity research around the world. Is captivity research around the world a matter of some significance that we should also consider?
Thank you for your question. The question about the generalizability of my findings with the Marineland and Vancouver Aquarium is that there really isn't a lot of research being done with captive animals that gets into the scientific literature, and that therefore has an impact upon our understanding of these animals. Certainly, I wanted to make a sort of a clarification that in my view, the Vancouver Aquarium is doing fabulous research with wild animals. So the work that they're doing with wild animals is excellent. It's substantive. It gets into the peer-reviewed literature. There's a lot of it, and so forth. So this is not about necessarily an indictment of the entire research effort at Vancouver Aquarium. What it is a simple statement of fact about the fact that in terms of their captive population, their scientific contribution is virtually nil. But most certainly, I think a recent report, and I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly. I think it was done by someone in the AZA, the American version of CASA, showing that a small percentage of research done with dolphins and whales is done with captive animals anyway. So we're really talking about a tiny, tiny proportion of what's done anywhere in the world. That's a long-winded answer to, yeah, there's not a whole lot of captive work being done that actually makes a difference.
Seems to me that one can't discount totally the benefit of research on captive animals, though, because you yourself talked about the research that you did, which is obviously an enlightening piece of work. But in addition to that, it appears to me that at the very least, research on wild animals in captivity, who are otherwise healthy, has certainly shown that putting them into captivity makes them unhealthy. And
yes.
I wanted to know if you had any comment about research which shows the negative impact of taking a healthy wild animal into captivity, such as cetaceans.
Sure. Yeah, it is absolutely the case that we have learned quite a bit about cognition, intelligence, self-awareness in dolphins and whales from studies in captivity. A lot of the work was done in Hawaii by Dr. Lou Herman, the late Dr. Lou Herman. And so, yes, we do know something about the cognition and the intelligence level and the self-awareness level of these animals from experiments. What we've learned is that they are the type of animal that cannot thrive in a concrete tank. We've learned that, and if we want to respond to that, then the idea is not to continue to keep them in concrete tanks, but to do better by them. The evidence is building that animals, wild animals like dolphins and whales, were kept in displays, exhibit all kinds of abnormal behaviors like stereotypies, repetitive behaviors, going back and forth with the head. It's something you see in humans all the time when they are emotionally disturbed and chronically stressed. We see this in dolphins and whales in concrete tanks all the time. We see them dying of infections that indicate or suggest that their immune systems are going down due to the chronic stress of living for years in a concrete tank. And what's interesting about that is that it's not just the individuals who have been taken from the wild and put into a captive environment. It's individuals who were born in captivity. So even those dolphins and whales who were born into concrete tanks suffer the same problems as those who were taken from the wild. To me, what that says is that the very nature of this animal is not compatible with living in a concrete tank.
From the letter writing campaign that's been going on, it's obvious to me that members of the public have been led to believe that this proposed bill bans all research and bans even the taking of animals who are in distress or injured into captivity, and it doesn't do that at all.
No, it doesn't.
And you're aware of that.
Yes.
But the question that I have is that, and I have to admit that I don't know the research in this area. If an animal has been injured and taken into captivity because of the injury and is able to be rehabilitated, is it conceivable they can be released back into the wild, or do they have to stay in captivity?
No, it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. There's no blanket statement that somebody can make to say that when an animal is injured in the wild or sick in the wild, taken into captivity, rehabilitated, that they cannot then go back out and be re-released. It really depends upon the animal's age, what the problem was to begin with, whether you can find the natal group. There have been many reintroductions to the wild that have been successful. And it really depends upon the individual circumstances. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll go in second round.
Thank
Madam
you,
Chair.
Senator
Thank
Sinclair. Senator Foray, please.
Merci beaucoup
Thank you very much for your presentation. I come from Rimouski. It's kind of like the sounds that echoes. I come from Rimouski, where a lot of your colleagues conduct research on belugas in particular and marine science. In an ideal world, there shouldn't be, just like when we have people in hospitals, we shouldn't have animals in captivity. And we would ideally live in a world that's not polluted and where the natural habitat would not be polluted. That's what we all want. But we don't live in an ideal world. When we talk about their notions, centers like Marineland or the Vancouver Aquarium try to educate people, but you have to distinguish education from awareness. They learn to respect animals, but it is clear that for me, we can think that although there's no real notion of education, young kids can discover some animal species. It can allow them to admire and respect these animals and to increase their level of respect for these individuals. Sometimes it has no impact, but in many cases, it can even be an advantage. One of the things that I retain from your presentation is that cetaceans, particularly in terms of their acute sense of hearing, suffer a lot from their current conditions because they're in captivity. There are two cases, and what I'm wondering is that, is there a compromise that can be reached? We heard a lot of witnesses, among which the Zoo and Aquarium Association, the CAZA, that auto-inspects. But do you think that we can reach a compromise to lessen the drawbacks of some cetaceans that they experience, whether it be dolphins or other animals, that for one reason or another remain in captivity because they were placed there? Given the knowledge and expertise you have, can we reach a consensus, given their standards, that could allow these animals to have acceptable detention, captivity conditions, not ideal conditions, but acceptable conditions? There are some humans that are kept in institutions for chronic diseases and they spend their lives there. But can we improve the acoustic conditions of these concrete tanks? But I'm worried that CAZA inspects its own members. Are you worried about the standards of these organizations? And do you think these standards are relevant, or are they too loose or too permissive?
Okay, well, you're the one who should answer this, but the question was about the standards that CASA has for its self-inspections of the facilities. Are they too loose? And the earlier part of the question was about is there some intermediate we can use? And I think, again, Marino is the person to answer that.
So I think that the scientific evidence is there that dolphins and whales don't thrive in facilities where they're kept in concrete tanks. And as a body of accreditation, a professional accreditation, CASA is under responsibility, has a responsibility to look at the science and to see what the science says about the animals that they are regulating or caring for. So yes. In response to the issue of whether there is an intermediate, there most definitely is. And the intermediate is to create seaside sanctuaries for those animals, to move them into natural water where they can experience the natural rhythms of the ocean, the diversity of an ocean environment, where they have orders of magnitude more space, more depth, and can live out their lives in the best way that they can, given that they probably cannot be just dumped back into the ocean, as it were. So with a sanctuary, a seaside sanctuary, what you have is the best of both worlds. You have the ability to care for the animals with the same level of veterinary expertise that you would have at any facility, Vancouver Aquarium, etc. But you're doing your best for the animals. You're providing a life that gives them back a little bit of what was taken when they were put into a concrete tank. And it provides an educational experience for people, people who can see the animals in the ocean, can understand why they're in a sanctuary, why they're not in concrete tanks, and why they can't go back out into the wild, what their histories have been. To me, that is the clear response to the issues that we're talking about here today. It's been done with elephants and great apes and big cats and so forth, and it can be done with dolphins and whales. So the answer is really seaside sanctuaries, which can provide all of the kinds of visitor experiences that you'd like to have.
Another question. Where I live, it's clear that where I live, there are a lot of beluga observations. Well, when there are humans, there are human interventions. We also have to realize that there's companies that almost live off these belugas and whales in the Saguenay region. We have to make sure that the standards of this activity correspond to the well-being of these animals that are concerned. And my question, and you said that you showed clearly that research conducted, and it was well documented, but was not very well used on cetaceans studied in captivity. But are there other types of research that has been conducted on cetaceans in captivity that was used for other scientific means, not just rather, is there research that was used to study the behavior of these animals in captivity? But have we used other scientific avenues to do research on these animals in captivity?
I did not hear any of that for this, so I'm sorry.
I think I can answer. So there has been research on a number of areas of biology focused on whales in captivity, and in addition to the cognitive aspects that Laurie mentioned, there's been quite a lot of work on physiology, and the facilities run by the U.S. Navy, particularly in San Diego, have been pretty productive in that area. You mentioned behavior, and there have been studies of behavior in the wild, but behavior is what I specialize on, and in general, I find them not very useful in interpreting what's going on in the wild, because this setting is so very, very different. So, for instance, there have been studies showing patterns of dominance among the whales in a tank, and but when we look at animals in the wild, we don't see those, and that may be because if you put animals in a tank, it really, changes the nature of the social relationships. But given that, there have been studies on behavior in tanks which have greatly intrigued me. Obviously, this study Laurie did on self-awareness was a particularly important example, but I've long been intrigued of studies of descriptions of dolphins in tanks imitating vacuum cleaners. I'm interested in social learning and how the animals learn, and some of these observations of captive animals have been pretty intriguing, but how they relate to the animals in the wild, I'm not sure.
Madame la Présidente, une dernière.
Quickly.
One last short question. This is a very specific field. But what are the best practices throughout the world? Because there are other centers, or in Monterey. Are there places that are a benchmark for practices for cetaceans in captivity? Are there places that are examples that we should hold up, aside from having seaside sanctuaries? Are there models that we could use as inspiration?
The question really gets to the heart of the matter. Yes, I do. The question has to do with, are there any facilities that hold captive dolphins and whales currently that are doing it right, that should be held up as a gold standard? The answer is that, one, there's a great deal of variability across the world, obviously. And two, that the answer presupposes that there is a way to do it right by keeping these animals in concrete tanks. Unfortunately, and this is, we're talking about good intentions here. We're talking about these aquariums and the veterinarians who work with them and the trainers who work with them wanting to do the best by the animals. That doesn't mean they can. And the reason is because there's a fundamental incompatibility between who dolphins and whales are and what they're afforded in a concrete tank. You cannot make a concrete tank deep enough or big enough in any reasonable sense to meet their needs. You cannot provide the kinds of social interactions that they would normally have in the wild to meet their needs. You cannot give them the challenges that they would normally have in a diverse wild environment to meet their needs. You're feeding them dead fish. In many cases, you're forcing them to do behaviors that they have to do just to get reinforced. So the answer is no. The answer is that there are just some animals who can't thrive in these kinds of environments, and we should just acknowledge that. We know this is the case for elephants as well, for very similar reasons. So it's really not a matter of not wanting to do the best thing. It's just a question of whether you can fit a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't work.
Thank you, Senator Foray. We now have 5 questions to come, and I'm going to ask if the 5 questioners might give the witnesses their question, and then we'll ask for an answer, if that's okay. So we will begin with Senator Rain.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been very interesting. My question is for Dr. Marino. Your bio says you are with the Whale Sanctuary Project. We still haven't heard exactly what the Whale Sanctuary Project is. So if you could expand on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm the president and co-founder of the Whale Sanctuary Project, and this is a project that was started last year. It's a nonprofit organization, and our mission is simply to create a seaside sanctuary for dolphins and whales who are now in concrete tanks. We have over 45 professional advisors on our team, including Dr. Whitehead. We have veterinarians, marine mammal scientists, engineers, and just what I would consider to be the gold standard team around the world coming together to create something that doesn't exist right now, and that's a seaside sanctuary for dolphins and whales who can then live out their lives in an environment that's as close as possible to what they should have been living in the first place. We are well on our way to finding a site for that sanctuary somewhere on either the west or east coast of North America, including Canada. And we hope to have the first sanctuary built by 2019.
Thank you.
Could I have Senator McGuinness with his question, Senator Plett, Senator Virgo, and then Senator Sinclair? We'll do them one after the other if we might, in the interest of time. Senator McGuinness?
Thank you. And it's right on the sanctuary. Who will fund this? And I'll just finish. How are they corralled? And have you visited Nova Scotia?
I've been to Nova Scotia twice.
And the waters are cold and deep.
I love Nova Scotia. It's beautiful. I've been up and down the eastern and southern coast. I have seen many, many sites there, and we are considering, there are 6 sites that we are now considering in Nova Scotia. We have met with First Nations people there. We have met with members of DFO. They have all been very, very enthusiastic, encouraging, and supportive of siting the sanctuary there, particularly because a sanctuary will bring a lot of revenue to a community, wherever that community is, that a local community. So it's just a win-win for everyone. We're also looking on the BC coast and in Washington State. And again, everywhere we go, people want this, in their province or in their state. And what we are doing is looking at all of the data, all of the scientific data on the environmental impact, all of the regulations, just doing our homework on that, to come up with a site that is the best site, not only for the animals, but for the local community and the province. So, yes, we have been to Nova Scotia. I've been very fortunate, and beautiful coast.
How will it be funded?
Oh, I'm sorry. The funding will come mainly from private funders. We have a major donor right now, in addition to other donors. Our major donor is Munchkin Corporation. They are a baby product company in California. The CEO, Stephen Dunn, says that he went to see orcas in concrete tanks one time, and then he had an MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and he went in that scanner and he came out and he was driving home and he thought, oh my gosh, this is how these animals must feel in a concrete tank. And he wants to see them have a better life, and he's devoted a lot of his time to doing this. So he's given us money to continue to develop our project. He's pledged over $1 million, and he will be helping us with further fundraising.
Thank you.
Senator Plett, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I will try to be brief with a few comments and questions here. First of all, I think we should really clarify that these animals are not in tanks. They are in possibly concrete pools, but they are outside. They are not in a room like this. They have the ability to swim outside and look at the open skies, both at Marineland and at Vancouver Aquarium. So the concrete tank is not correct, and I think that should be on the record. You may be right that maybe you can't go deep enough and big enough. I can't argue that with you because I'm not a professional there. But they do have open skies to look at. But that isn't my question. You talked, Ms. Marino, about nobody's giving you evidence. Well, Dr. Michael Noonan, he is a professor of animal behavior and an independent academic who has studied beluga whales in Marineland for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. Now, he's coming here, so we'll ask him questions, but I would like you to comment on this. He is not employed by Marineland, right. But he says that of all the animals in captivity, cetaceans fare among the best. He also told me personally when I asked him the question that there is no evidence that he sees that these whales and the belugas and dolphins are not happy. He says he can't talk to them. Contrary to you, he does not believe they're people that he can communicate with on a personal basis.
Excuse me, I don't believe they're people
please.
either.
And the chair asked me to finish, and then you could answer all of my comments or questions, please. So in light of time, I want to do that. And
sure.
Second to that, Dr. Michael Kinzel, a zoo pathologist and program director at the University of Illinois, said when asked about freeing marine mammals from human care, and I quote, "I don't know that those individual animals in the wild would be any better served by us being ignorant of their condition or their medicine and their diseases and things that we are gaining from keeping these animals in captivity that are applicable to animals in the wild. Should we ever wish to, for example, intervene in a disease outbreak in one of these free-ranging species without any knowledge of how to treat what the expression of the disease is, what the efficacy of the treatment would be, these are all things that come from our experiences. In the wild, you would be entering into a situation where you are trying to intervene with complete ignorance behind you instead of a toolbox full of experience that affords a cogent way forward." And lastly, very quickly, the fact that you believe in the personhood of these animals, what is your opinion of the killing of whales in the Arctic when the local people do that there for their livelihood?
Thank you. I'll try to take that sort of going from the most recent fact. My personal opinion about subsistence whaling is very different from what it is in terms of keeping these animals in concrete tanks for entertainment. People have to make a living, and it's not for me to say. People have to make a living. They have to eat. They have to feed their families. And it's not for me to say whether subsistence whaling is right or wrong. It is a completely separate issue. I'm going to turn to the disease issue. And the question seems to imply that somehow if we don't do research on captive animals, if there's a disease outbreak in the wild, that we're going to be caught off guard. But I just want to remind you, the fact that there is hardly any evidence anyway being done on captive animals on disease processes, let alone the movement of those data into the conservation realm. The data are just not there. They're just not doing it. Vancouver Aquarium has had over 30 years to do this kinds of research, and they're not doing it. Now, if you want to study disease in a wild population, I agree, that's really important. So study it in the wild population. Do what you need to do. But the evidence suggests that there's no reason to have animals in concrete tanks in order to respond to these kinds of population issues, as wild population issues. Oh, Dr. Noonan is a colleague of mine, and of course he would say that these animals are doing well, because that's what he makes. He makes his living on doing research with these animals. I don't make my living on it. I stopped doing that research. Dr. Noonan has done a lot of research with the animals at Marineland, most of it unpublished. And his students do research in that area, so yeah, I mean, I hardly would consider him an unbiased opinion about whether or not those animals should be kept in tanks. And finally, they are concrete tanks, let's face it. I mean, whether they're made of concrete or some other substance, what matters to a dolphin and a whale is not available in these display facilities. What matters to them is the ability to travel long distances. They can't do that. And what matters to them is the ability to dive deep. Can't do that. So yes, they may be able to look at the sky. So I concede that, but that is far from what makes life worth living for an animal that dives in the wild, sometimes for minutes at a time and can travel 100 miles a day. So yeah, I can see that, but the two most important parts of that captive part of it are not there.
Don't misrepresent it though and say they are tanks.
What are
not
they?
Tanks. Well, I'm
They're
a plumbing
tanks.
contractor. I know what a tank is. A tank is closed all the way around. This is not. No,
They're concrete.
Don't misrepresent what.
Okay, they're concrete pools that
Exactly.
do not allow them to dive or travel.
We can think it. We can think all we want.
Thank you, Senator Platt. Senator Enverga, please.
The same holds for concrete pools.
Okay, thank you,
ahead.
Chair. I think it's you call it concrete habitat. I think
Concrete.
that's the right word. Yeah, that's
I
good.
wouldn't even say a habitat, but
Yeah,
that's okay.
So anyway, my question is with regards to the seaside sanctuary. I expect that you're going to be putting iron bars around here or cables. I mean, if that's the case, then don't you think it's going to ruin the ecosystem of the whole area where you're going to be putting the sanctuary? Because what's going to be happening is we're going to, in a natural world, whales go in and out of the system. But now this time in a seaside sanctuary, they will be there forever. I mean, don't you think it will affect the ecosystem of wherever you're going to put it in? And at the same time, don't you think it's just going to be like just any fish pens, fish pens or like aquaculture? It's going to be like that. I mean, and then don't you think it will be, we will create more problems with our environment by putting in a seaside sanctuary?
Thanks for your questions. So a sanctuary, in our view, would be created by putting nets across land masses or constructing a barrier from nets. And this has been done before many times on a temporary basis. This would be done on a permanent basis. The amount of space and the depth of space that any resident of that sanctuary would be afforded would be orders of magnitude greater than what any captive animal is afforded currently. We're looking at least 65 square acres. We're looking at least 15 meters deep. And we're looking at providing the diversity that comes with being in a natural environment. Fish can swim in and out, they have rocks on the bottom, and so forth. Is it ideal? No. These animals should be living where they evolved in the natural environment, but they're not. And what we're trying to do is the best for them. And the best for them at this point, given that they cannot just be dumped back into the ocean, is to provide more of what they need to thrive. In terms of aquaculture, yeah, we are very concerned about that, and we are working with local communities, stakeholders, First Nations people, and so forth, to make sure that, whatever we do, wherever we do it, we're not having a negative impact on aquaculture. And again, as I said, we have a team of 45 professionals who are hard at work at this, looking at the various criteria and making sure that the kinds of concerns that you bring up, which are good concerns, are addressed. And again, as I mentioned, we are also not only addressing the possible risks, but also the positive aspects of this, that this brings to a local community. We will need people to build this, to work there, to be involved, and we hope that this is a place where people can take pride in, wherever it ends up.
So okay. By the way, I know it took too much time already. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Verga. Our last question to Senator Sinclair, please.
Thank you. The amendment to the criminal code that's proposed by this legislation is under the animal cruelty provisions of the criminal code. So I just wanted to ask if you have an opinion or wish to share with us your thoughts with regard to the question of whether you think that taking whales and dolphins and other cetaceans from the wild who are otherwise healthy and placing them into overly small pens and holding facilities and subjecting them to ineffective research or solely for the trade, for international trade or display or captive breeding programs amounts to cruelty or not? Without expressing an opinion on law, just generally, what do you think of that?
The scientific evidence is clear. My opinion is not really relevant. The scientific evidence tells us that it is cruelty because these animals suffer from, again, abnormalities in behavior and physiology that are indicative of chronic stress, immune system dysfunction, and they live shorter lives, generally, in these facilities. So the evidence is pretty clear.
Can I?
Sir, yes?
One thing that I haven't mentioned, but a lot of my recent research has been on the importance of culture for whales and dolphins. And I published a book a couple of years ago on this. And I believe that the evidence is showing that these are not only very social animals, but also very cultural animals. So what they learn from the other members of their societies is vital for how they live their lives and how they make their livings and for what they are. So when we place these animals in whatever you call them, then we are depriving them of that society. We are depriving them of that cultural milieu, which is how they live their lives. And I think that perhaps that gives us a link to your recent great work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the members of the Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, I'd like to thank both of you for being here today and for sharing your perspective on this very important subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The meeting is adjourned.